If you enjoy macabre mysteries and stories that seem to defy reality, subscribe to the channel now and turn on notifications. That way you won't miss any secrets we're about to reveal. The mansion stood like a living enigma in the heart of California, growing ceaselessly as if it had a will of its own. Amidst quiet streets and a seemingly ordinary neighborhood, that building stood out. Windows that led nowhere, doors that opened onto emptiness, and staircases that ended at the ceiling. Nothing there seemed to make sense, and perhaps that was precisely the intention. It all started with Eleanor Whitmore. She was no ordinary woman. Recently widowed from an arms industry magnate, she had inherited a colossal fortune, and along with it, an invisible weight that no one else seemed to notice. Since her husband's death, Eleanor hadn't slept, not really. Her eyes bore deep scars from sleepless nights, always attentive, always on alert, as if she were being watched. And perhaps it was. The first occurrence was discreet, a dry sound in the hallway during the early morning hours. A footstep, a crack. Eleanor couldn't distinguish. She rose slowly, clutching the candlestick with trembling hands. She walked to the door, opened it, and nothing. Only the heavy silence of a house that was too big, but it happened again. On subsequent nights the sound returned, closer, clearer, footsteps, dragging, persistent, and then came the whispers, at first almost inaudible, a murmur that seemed to come from inside the walls, disconnected words, overlapping voices, as if many people were trying to speak at the same time. Eleanor pressed her hands against her ears, but it was no use. It wasn't coming from outside. It was inside the house, or worse, inside it. Desperate, she searched for answers wherever she could. Doctors failed. Priests offered prayers that had no effect. Until, on the recommendation of an acquaintance, she met a man who promised no explanations, only truths. The medium. He lived in isolation, far from the city, in a simple house surrounded by tall trees and absolute silence. Eleanor arrived at dusk, accompanied only by her growing unease. The man received her without surprise, as if he had been expecting her. Before she could even say a word, he spoke. "They found you." Eleanor froze. The medium explained that the fortune she had inherited carried more than just money. Each weapon produced by her late husband's company had taken a life, and those lives hadn't simply disappeared. They remained, trapped, angry, hungry for justice, and now they were after her. The air grew heavy. "There's no escaping them," the man said with a disturbing calm. "But there are ways to confuse them." That's when the idea came about, at home. She was to build a residence that would never end. A place in constant flux. Corridors that led nowhere. Staircases without logic. False doors. Environments that would continually transform. A labyrinth. If they can't find her, they won't be able to reach her. Eleanor did not hesitate. That same month, construction began. He bought a vast, secluded plot of land. He hired laborers, architects, carpenters, but he didn't reveal his true purpose. The orders were simple. Build. Always build. Non-stop, day and night. And so it began. Initially, the construction followed normal patterns. Rooms, corridors, halls. But quickly, Eleanor began to interfere directly with the plans. She changed blueprints mid-construction. She ordered the destruction of newly built parts. She demanded alterations without explanation. The workers found it strange, but they were paid too well to question it. Over time, the house ceased to be a home. It transformed into something alive. Stairs leading to walls, doors concealing abysses. Interior windows facing other rooms, corridors that narrowed until they became unusable. Nothing followed human logic. Eleanor walked around as if she knew every inch of that chaos. But even so, the sounds continued. At night, footsteps echoed through places where no one should be. Tools disappeared. Workers swore they heard voices calling their names when they were alone. Some have quit their jobs, others remained silent. Eleanor, however, never stopped. She slept little, she ate even less. She spent hours observing plants, drawing new paths, creating new ways to confuse whatever was pursuing her. But there was something she would never admit. The whispers were becoming clearer. It was no longer just noise. They were words, calling for her, closer than ever. One night, while walking through one of the newly built corridors, Eleanor stopped abruptly. A door. She wasn't there before. The wood was old, worn, completely different from the rest of the house. As if it had been put there by something that wasn't part of the construction. Slowly she approached. The air around felt colder, too quiet. When she touched the doorknob, a whisper came from behind her, so close it made her whole body freeze. "We found you." Eleanor did not turn around. He didn't scream. He just opened the door. And what was on the other side shouldn't exist inside that house. Construction never stopped. During the day, the constant sound of hammers, saws, and hurried footsteps filled every corner of the property. At night, lamps illuminated incomplete corridors, creating shadows that seemed to move on their own. The mansion grew in every direction, sideways, upwards, and most unsettlingly, inwards. Eleanor Whitmore oversaw everything, but not as a mere owner. She was always present, always observing, always adjusting. No wall was erected without her approval. No staircase remained as planned. She walked the corridors with maps in hand, sketching changes while the work was still underway, and he never explained why. The workers began to notice strange patterns. Certain corridors were built and days later completely sealed off. Doors were installed, only to be removed the following week. Stairs appeared in unlikely places, often leading to ceilings too low to be used. An older carpenter named Thomas Hale was the first to question it, albeit discreetly. He wasn't superstitious, but he wasn't a fool either. On a quiet afternoon, while adjusting a door frame that had already been repositioned 3 times, he noticed something that didn't make sense. The measurements were wrong, but not due to human error. It was as if the space itself had shifted. The following night, Thomas decided to stay late. Hidden among tools and materials, he observed. Eleanor showed up alone. No employees, no assistants. She walked slowly down the hallway holding a notebook. She stopped at specific points, as if listening to something. Then she made markings on the wall with charcoal, symbols that Thomas didn't recognize. These were not building plans. They were instructions. But for whom? The silence of the night was broken only by her footsteps. Until she spoke. Not today. Thomas froze. She wasn't talking to anyone in sight. "It's not ready yet," he continued, his voice firm but low. "You'll have other options." A chill ran through the man's body. He retreated slowly without making a sound. That night, he decided he didn't want to understand anymore, but he didn't leave. The amount of money was too high, and perhaps curiosity was part of it too. Meanwhile, the surrounding city began to react. The mansion was no longer seen merely as an eccentric building. It had become a constant topic of conversation, rumors, and speculation. Some said Eleanor had gone mad after her husband's death. Others believed she was involved in the occult. Still others avoided even mentioning her name. But nobody was unaware. The constant flow of materials, workers, and changes was drawing too much attention. A local journalist, curious about the situation, tried to visit the property. He was stopped before even crossing the gates. No explanation, just a clear order. No one enters without permission. Eleanor didn't want any witnesses. Inside the house, the atmosphere also changed, not just physically. Something in the air seemed denser. The workers began to avoid certain corridors, not by order, but by instinct. Some swore they felt chills when passing through certain areas. Others said they heard footsteps synchronized with their own, always half a second behind, like an echo, but alive. There was an incident. One of the workers, a young, newly hired man, fell down an internal staircase. Nothing unusual on construction sites, except for the fact that he insisted he had been pushed. "I felt it," he said, trembling. "Someone was behind me." But there was no one there. After that, 2 more workers resigned. Thomas Hale remained. He observed more. He spoke less. He began to notice that Eleanor avoided certain spaces, but not out of fear. It seemed more like strategy, as if she were conducting something, guiding an invisible movement through the house. And then he realized something else. The house wasn't random. It was planned. Every apparent mistake was part of something bigger. The confusing corridors, the useless doors, the absurd staircases. Everything seemed to form a pattern when viewed from a broader perspective. A labyrinth with a purpose. But purpose for whom? One night, while walking through a newly constructed wing, Thomas found something that shouldn't be there. A plant, not drawn on paper, engraved directly on the wall. Deep lines, as if drawn with force. They represented the house, but not as it was. It was bigger, much bigger, with parts that didn't yet exist, or that they hadn't been built yet. In the center of the drawing, there was a symbol, the same one that Eleanor marked with charcoal. But there, it was finished. Full. Thomas felt a tightness in his chest. That wasn't planning. It was a prediction. The following morning, he tried to confront Eleanor. He found her in one of the halls, watching workers erect yet another seemingly pointless wall. "Mrs. Whitmore," he began hesitantly, "this house, is it finished yet?" She didn't answer immediately. He simply continued watching the construction. Then, slowly, she turned her face towards him. Her eyes looked different, deeper, darker. She always has been. Thomas said nothing more, and at that moment, for the first time, he was certain of something he had been avoiding accepting. The mansion wasn't being built to keep anything out. It was being built to contain something inside. From that moment on, everything changed. Thomas Hale could no longer see the mansion as a simple construction project. Every hammer blow, every wall erected, every absurd staircase now carried a hidden meaning. He was no longer just working with wood and tools. He was unwittingly helping to build something he didn't understand, and that started to affect him. The days began to seem shorter, the nights longer. The fatigue accumulated in a strange way, as if it weren't physical but mental. He began to get lost inside his own house. Hallways he swore he knew seemed different every morning, and he wasn't the only one. Other workers began to show similar signs. They forgot simple routes, got confused in newly constructed areas, and reported a constant feeling of being watched. But now, something new was emerging. The voices were no longer confined to the night. During the day, amidst the noise of the tools, some workers would suddenly stop, looking around with blank expressions. "Did you hear that?" they asked. But no one else was listening, Eleanor realized, and contrary to expectations, she did not try to contain the situation. She sped up the work. More workers were hired. New wings began to appear simultaneously. Orders were given urgently, often contradictory, but always with the same objective: to expand, as if time were running out. Thomas decided to investigate. He began mentally mapping the house, trying to find logic where before he only saw chaos. He spent his breaks walking through little-used hallways, observing details, noting changes. And that's how he found the first mistake. A corridor that shouldn't exist. He was absolutely certain that the space had been sealed off days before. He himself had helped install the wall. But there it was, open, intact, as if it had never been touched. With his heart racing, he went inside. The air was different, heavy, cold. The sounds of construction disappeared as soon as he took a few steps forward. It was as if he had crossed over to another place, even though he was still inside the same house. At the end of the corridor, there was a door. The same. The wood was old, worn, and completely out of keeping with the mansion's style. Thomas felt his body freeze. He didn't know how, but he knew he'd seen that door before. Not with his eyes, but with his mind, like a memory that wasn't his own. He approached slowly. Before he could touch the doorknob, he heard something, a sound behind him, steps, quick, out of sync. He turned around abruptly, and there was no one there. But the footsteps continued, now around him, echoing off the walls, the ceiling, the floor. Voices began to emerge along with the sound, whispers, different shades, different intensities, but all carrying the same message, anger. Thomas stepped back, trying to maintain control. "Is anyone there?" he said, his voice faltering. Silence answered for a second, and then a single sentence, clear, too close. "You're helping her." The air became thick. Thomas Corot. He left the corridor almost stumbling, the sound of tools returning abruptly, as if nothing had happened. The other workers continued their tasks normally, oblivious to what he had just experienced. But he knew that wasn't my imagination. That same night, he decided to confront Eleanor again. He found it on one of the upper levels, where a new set of stairs was being built, one that led in 3 different directions, none of them logical. "This needs to stop," he said bluntly. Eleanor did not turn around. "It started a long time ago," he replied calmly. "What's in this house?" Silence. For a few seconds, only the distant sound of tools filled the space. Then she spoke. "They are not trying to enter." Thomas felt his stomach churn. "They're already here." The words hung in the air like something concrete. "This house," she continued, "isn't a labyrinth to confuse. It's a structure to contain. Every wall, every detour, every mistake keeps them moving, keeps them trapped." Thomas shook his head in disbelief. "That doesn't make sense." "Do it," she said, finally turning around, "because if they stop—" She took a step towards him. Her eyes were intense, almost feverish. "They find it." The silence that followed was heavier than any explanation. Thomas backed away slowly. Everything fell into place now. The changing corridors, the voices, the accidents, the constant feeling of movement. It wasn't the house that was being built. It was a prison. And something inside her was learning. In the following days, the events intensified. Tools began disappearing more frequently. Doors would close on their own. Workers reported seeing figures in the corners of hallways, always out of focus, always disappearing when they tried to look directly at them. A worker simply disappeared. No noise, no signs. It just disappeared. The search was conducted. Every room, every wing, every staircase. Nothing. Eleanor showed no surprise. He simply ordered that a new wall be built on the spot where he had last been seen. Seal, contain, continue. Thomas watched everything, but now with genuine fear, because he realized something even worse. The house was growing faster, much faster than it should be possible, as if it no longer depended solely on the workers. With the workers' disappearance, the atmosphere inside the mansion changed irreversibly. No one spoke openly about it, but everyone knew. The silence among the workers ceased to be merely uncomfortable. It became complicit. Glances were exchanged, conversations were interrupted when someone approached, and entire areas of the house began to be avoided, even without direct orders. But Eleanor didn't allow for breaks. On the contrary, she increased the pace of construction like never before. New wings sprang up practically overnight. Staircases were rebuilt before they were even used. Newly constructed corridors were already being modified, as if they were always one step behind something or someone. And it was in this environment that new stories began to emerge. Fragments of something bigger, connecting people, the past, and the house itself. Thomas Hale, now more cautious, was not alone in his suspicions. There was also Margaret Collins, a young woman responsible for organizing the materials and records of the project. Unlike the others, she paid attention to administrative details, dates, deadlines, old blueprints. and she was the one who found the first concrete inconsistency. "That doesn't add up," she said one afternoon, showing Thomas a set of records. The documents indicated deliveries of materials for parts of the house that, officially, did not yet exist. "Are they building before they plan?" Thomas asked. Margaret shook her head. "No. It's as if they already knew those parts were going to exist." That confirmed what Thomas had feared. The house was not being built in the present. It already existed, in some way. Meanwhile, another layer of reality began to manifest itself. A group of older workers began to share their experiences, discreetly, away from the others. They recounted dreams, but these were not ordinary dreams. It was always the same people. Endless corridors, doors that multiplied. And at the center of it all, a room. A room that no one remembered building, but everyone knew how to get to her. One of the men, visibly shaken, described what he saw inside. "I had nothing, and at the same time I had everything. It was as if they were waiting." Thomas listened to that in silence. He had seen something similar before, at the door. It's always that door. Margaret, in turn, began to investigate the Whitmore family's old records more thoroughly. She searched city archives, found old newspaper clippings, and forgotten documents. And what he discovered added a new layer of complexity to the story. Eleanor's late husband's company did more than just produce weapons. She had been responsible for supplying resources in extremely violent conflicts, many of them marked by poorly documented massacres. Official records were scarce, but there were unofficial accounts, testimonies, letters, denunciations, hundreds, maybe thousands of deaths. Margaret took everything to Thomas. "It's not just blame," she said. "It's a consequence." That changed the perspective. It wasn't just a tormented woman. It was something bigger, something collective. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued with her increasingly extreme behavior. She began to completely isolate certain areas of the house, prohibiting any access. Not even the oldest workers could enter. These areas were sealed off with multiple layers of doors, false staircases, and confusing corridors, as if something there was more dangerous than the rest. Thomas began to notice another pattern. These restricted areas were always located near where the most intense events were taking place. Disappearances, voices, unexplained changes in the structure. It was as if Eleanor was moving the problem, pushing it away, but not eliminating them. The pressure was mounting. Time seemed to run faster inside the mansion. Days blurred together. Some workers swore they had spent hours in a hallway, when outside only minutes had passed. The reality inside the house was no longer reliable, and then the most unsettling subplot took shape. Margaret disappeared, without warning, without signs, but unlike the previous worker, something was found. A notebook, the same one she used for taking notes. Inside, pages and pages of detailed records, makeshift maps, connections between areas of the house, construction patterns, and that's a conclusion, written several times, as if she were trying to convince herself the house isn't holding them captive, it's feeding them. Thomas felt his heart race. That changed everything. If that were true, then every new wall, every new staircase, every new hallway. I wasn't controlling the problem, I was getting stronger. On the last page, there was something even more disturbing. A drawing. The same plant that Thomas had seen on the wall, but now complete. And in the center, marked with force, a single dot. The room, that same dream room. And below the drawing, a phrase, "That's where everything converges." Thomas slowly closed the notebook. For the first time, he felt more than just fear. He felt a sense of urgency, because now there was a new question, even more dangerous than all the previous ones. Did Eleanor know this? Or was she being guided there? Thomas couldn't sleep that night. Margaret's notebook lay open on the table, as if the words were still being written before her eyes. The house isn't holding you captive. It's feeding you." That phrase echoed more powerfully than any whisper he had ever heard within the mansion. If that were true, then everything was wrong from the start. Eleanor wasn't saving herself. Everything was getting worse. The following morning, Thomas made a decision. He would find the room. It didn't matter what was there. Using Margaret's incomplete maps and notes, he began to piece together a route. It wasn't a straightforward path. In fact, it seemed the opposite. The house's layout demanded detours, U-turns, and seemingly wrong choices. It was as if the only way to get to the center was to get completely lost first. Thomas began his journey during the afternoon shift, blending in with the workers so as not to attract attention. He carried only a flashlight, his notebook, and a piece of charcoal to mark the path. But he soon realized that scoring goals was pointless. The signs disappeared, or worse, they would change locations. Still, he continued. He climbed stairs that led to narrow corridors, descended levels that shouldn't exist, passed through doors he swore he'd never seen before. The sound of construction faded into the distance until it disappeared completely, and then silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that shouldn't exist in such a large place. Thomas knew. He was nearby. The air was colder, heavier. Each breath seemed to require effort. The feeling of being watched returned, but now it wasn't vague. She was focused, direct, as if something knew exactly where he was. He turned down one last corridor and found it. The room. It was unlike anything else in the mansion. There was no exaggeration, no confusion, no absurd staircase, no false door. It was a perfectly symmetrical space almost, normal, but that was what was most frightening. In the center of the room, there was something that shouldn't be there. A collection of objects, ancient, worn out, scattered in an organized manner, as if forming a kind of memorial. Thomas approached slowly, and then he understood. Each object represented a life. Uniform buttons, metal fragments, burnt letters, small personal belongings, and in the midst of them, a record, a book. He opened it. Names, hundreds, maybe thousands, listed one after the other, victims. Suddenly the air changed, the silence was broken, and the voices came, not like before. Now they were clear, high. Gifts. You see now. Thomas fell to his knees, pressing his hands against his head. The voices weren't around. They were inside the room. Inside it. She promised. She said she would give us peace. But it keeps us here. The words overlapped, creating a chorus that was impossible to ignore. Thomas tried to stand up, but something stopped him. Not physically, something deeper, as if the space itself were holding him there. The house is growing, and we too. Despair took over. "What do you want?" he shouted. For a second, silence, and then a single answer in unison. "To go out." His heart raced. "Then why don't you leave?" The response came more slowly, heavier, "Because she won't let me." The air got even colder, and then a new sound emerged. Steps, real, behind him. Thomas turned slowly. Eleanor was standing in the doorway of the room, but something was different. She didn't seem surprised. She didn't seem scared. She seemed relieved. "I knew someone would come here," she said with a disturbing calmness. Thomas stood up with difficulty. "This has to stop," he said. "You're keeping them locked up here." Eleanor smiled, a small, tired smile. "No, Thomas," he replied. She took a step forward. "I'm preventing them from leaving." The voices began to grow louder again, now more agitated, more aggressive. "They don't just want to leave," she continued. "They want to take someone with them." Thomas felt his body grow cold. "You don't understand," she said, now more firmly. "When construction stops, they find a way." Silence fell again. "And when they find them," she finished, "the whole city pays." Thomas looked around, for objects, for the names, to the living room. And then he realized something that took his breath away. The number of objects was greater than the number of names in the book. He looked at Eleanor. "There are more people here than there should be." She didn't answer, but her gaze confirmed it. Then, slowly, she said, "Not everyone came because of the weapons." The world seemed to stop. "Some," she continued, "they came because of the house." The voices exploded. The space shook. The walls vibrated as if something was trying to break through. And in that instant, Thomas understood the true horror. The mansion was not just a prison, it was an attraction, and everything that went into it. He never left again. The impact of the truth brought no relief. It brought urgency. As soon as Eleanor finished speaking, the room reacted as if it had been awakened. The voices, previously organized in a comprehensible chorus, became chaotic. Shouts, pleas, anger, all mixed together in a sonic pressure that seemed to push the air out of Thomas's lungs. The walls vibrated. The objects on the floor began to tremble slightly, as if responding to the living presence within. "You shouldn't have come here," Eleanor said, her tone now more tense. "They can sense when someone understands." Thomas tried to maintain his balance. "That's not control," he replied with difficulty. "That's a cycle. You're feeding it." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment, as if I'd already had that discussion many times. "And what's the alternative?" she asked, opening her eyes again. "To stop?" The silence that followed was brief and menacing. As if the room itself were waiting for that answer, Thomas said nothing, because he knew if construction stopped, something would happen, something worse. Voices began to align again as if they were focusing. Now there was intention, direction. "He can leave, he can take, he understands." Thomas felt his body freeze. "They're talking about me," she whispered. Eleanor nodded slowly. "They always choose someone." The air grew heavier. "In the beginning, they were just trying to escape," she said. "But with time, they learned." Thomas took a step back. "What did they learn?" Eleanor replied without hesitation. "Using people." Before he could react, the door to the room slammed shut behind them. Alone. The impact resonated like a signal. The voices grew louder. Now it wasn't just whispers. Those were orders. "Abra, walk, bring us." Thomas put his hands to his head. Images began to emerge. Corridors, exits, doors that led outside the house. He could see everything, as if the labyrinth finally made sense, as if someone were showing the way. "They are guiding me," he said, his voice trembling. Eleanor approached quickly. "Don't follow." But it was too late. Thomas's body began to respond before his mind. One step. Then another one, towards the door. "Thomas," Eleanor said firmly, "you need to resist." He paused for a second. He took a deep breath, but the voices returned, stronger, clearer. "Just open it. Just go out. There's only one way." The conflict was visible. Every muscle in his body trembled, alternating between moving forward and stopping. "If I go out," he said with difficulty, "will they go out with me?" Eleanor did not respond immediately. And that was already answer enough. "How many?" he asked. Silence. So finally, "I don't know anymore." The words fell like a sentence. Despair filled Thomas's eyes. "So this never ends?" Eleanor shook her head. "Not in the way you think." The voices began to change again. Now there was something different, something new. Expectation, as if they were realizing a possibility, a loophole. The room got darker, even without any change in the lighting. The air seemed to contract. "They're stronger here," Eleanor said, looking around. "This room, it's where everything converges." Thomas was breathing with difficulty, but then something inside him changed. The pressure did not decrease, but he began to understand. The visions he received were not just commands. They were maps, information, standards. He looked at Eleanor. "The house isn't just holding people captive," he said, his voice firmer. "It's organizing them. Eleanor remained silent. Every corridor, every change, he continued, isn't random. You're guiding them here. I'm concentrating, she corrected. Thomas looked around, for objects, to the center, to the space that seemed to pulsate. So this room, he said slowly, that's the breaking point. The silence that followed was different, heavy, definitive. Eleanor did not deny it. If something happens here, Thomas said, it happens everywhere. The voices reacted immediately, more intense, more agitated, as if they were agreeing or waiting. And then, for the first time, Eleanor demonstrated something she hadn't shown before. Fear. That's why I never let anyone get this far, she said quietly. Thomas looked at the closed door, then to the center of the room. And then he made a decision. Perhaps that's exactly why someone needed to arrive. Eleanor stepped forward. You don't know what you're saying. But he no longer seemed the same. The fear was still there, but now there was something more: clarity. If this is a cycle, he said, then it can be broken. The voices fell silent for a moment, as if they were listening, as if they were interested. Eleanor watched Thomas intently, trying to understand, trying to predict. But for the first time, she didn't have complete control of the situation, and that was exactly what the house seemed to want. Thomas did not back down. For the first time since entering the mansion, he wasn't reacting to fear, he was confronting it. The pressure was still there, the voices still echoed around him, but something inside him had changed. He was no longer just someone trying to survive. Now he wanted to understand and to act. Eleanor watched in silence. There was something different about that man. All the others who got too close had broken, gave in to fear, to the voices, to despair. But Thomas was adapting, and that was dangerous. Do you think you can control this? She asked in a harsher tone. Thomas shook his head. Not control, he replied, but perhaps interrupt. He began to walk slowly around the room, ignoring the whispers that were returning, more subtle now, more attentive. He was analyzing the space, each object, every detail, perfect symmetry. You said you concentrate them here, he continued, but concentration isn't the solution. It's preparation. Eleanor crossed her arms, tense. Preparation for what? Thomas stopped in the center of the room. He looked at the ground, then up to the ceiling. To bring it to a close, the voices reacted, a slight increase in intensity, but not of anger, expectation, as if they were hearing something they wanted to hear, or they were afraid. They want to get out, Thomas said, but they can't do it alone. They need someone alive. Eleanor did not interrupt. And you've spent years trying to stop that, he continued, keeping them moving, preventing them from finding a way. He looked up, but that only made them stronger. Silence, heavy, undeniable. Eleanor looked away for a moment. It was the first time someone had said that, and it made sense. So what do you suggest? She asked, with a slight challenging tone. Thomas took a deep breath. If they want to leave, then maybe we should let them. The air froze. The voices stopped completely. An absolute silence filled the room. Eleanor stepped forward, incredulous. You're crazy. No, he said firmly. I see the pattern. He started walking again, now with more conviction. You tried to contain it, and it only accumulated. They are trapped, but they are not static. They are organizing themselves, learning, growing. He pointed to the objects on the floor. This isn't just memory, it's energy. Eleanor took a deep breath, trying to maintain control. If you open that path, she said, there's no way to predict what happens next. Thomas nodded. I know. He looked directly at her. But continuing like this doesn't solve anything either. Silence returned. The voices began to emerge again, but now they were different, softer, closer. He understands. He sees. He can... Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. And then he did something he had never done before. He heard, but not out of fear. Pay attention. The voices ceased to be a chaos. They started to organize themselves. Isolated phrases began to connect, fragmented stories, pain, anger, but also something unexpected. Tiredness. They weren't just furious. They were prisoners, exhausted. They don't want to destroy everything, Thomas said, opening his eyes. They want to end it. Eleanor stood motionless. End? How? She asked. Thomas hesitated, because that was the hardest part. Leaving, he replied, or taking someone with them. The silence returned, heavier than ever. Eleanor understood immediately. No, she said, almost in a whisper. It's not like that. Thomas did not look away. It's always been like this. The voices grew louder again, now more intense, more focused. One for many, one for all. Balance. The meaning was clear. Eleanor took a step back. I won't let that happen. Thomas took a deep breath. You already left. She stared at him. Every person who disappeared here, he continued, it wasn't an accident. The words hit like a blow. They're already trying. The silence that followed was broken only by a faint sound, a pulse, coming from the center of the room. Like a heart. The whole house seemed to respond. Far away, construction sounds began to echo faster, more intensely, as if something was reacting to the decision that was being formed inside. Eleanor looked around. For the first time, she didn't seem to be in control. If this gets out of here, she said, there's no going back. Thomas nodded slowly. So we need to make sure it ends here. The voices fell silent again, as if they were waiting, observing, choosing. Thomas looked toward the center of the room, then to Eleanor. And then, with a calmness he hadn't shown before, he said, the question is no longer whether anyone will leave here. He paused. It's who. The air grew heavy, absolute silence. And at that moment, it became clear the cycle would not be broken without a price. And someone would have to pay. The decision was already up in the air. Invisible, but inevitable. The entire mansion seemed to react to that moment. The sound of construction, which never ceased, began to change rhythm. Hammers pounded faster, planks creaked louder, as if the structure itself were being pressed by something internal. Something I knew. Thomas remained in the center of the room, motionless, absorbing every detail, every vibration, every whisper that now emerged with greater clarity. It was no longer chaotic noise. There was intention, direction, and urgency. Eleanor, on the other hand, seemed to be on the verge of losing the control she had maintained for years. This can't leave this place, she said, looking around as if the house could hear her. And perhaps it could. Then we need to close the loop, Thomas replied. He bent down and began rearranging some of the objects on the floor. Not randomly, there was a pattern. He was following something that only he seemed to be able to see now. The voices were guiding, but not like before, not forcefully, with precision, Eleanor realized. You're letting them in, she said, her tone a mixture of fear and disbelief. No, Thomas replied without pausing. I'm listening. He positioned the objects in an imperfect circle. Each item seemed to vibrate slightly when moved, as if reacting to contact. This here, he continued, isn't just a point of concentration. It's a point of decision. The room responded. The air became denser. The slight pulsing in the center grew stronger. Rhythmic, like a heart about to explode. Meanwhile, outside the room, the house began to reorganize itself. The corridors were changing. The stairs creaked. Doors slammed shut, despite no wind at all. The workers, scattered throughout the mansion, began to feel it. Tools fell from their hands. Some stopped completely, looking around, as if they had forgotten where they were. Others started walking, without direction, without awareness, as if they were being called. Inside the room, Eleanor took a step back. They're moving, she said, almost in a panic. Thomas nodded, because they know the time has come. He stood up slowly. The circle was complete, imperfect, but functional. "This place," he said, "wasn't just made for prisoners." He looked at Eleanor. It was made for channeling. Voices began to align again. Now there weren't many. They seemed like one. Choice. The word echoed throughout the entire room. Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. He took a deep breath. When it opened again, there was a decision to be made, but also fear. "If someone goes out with them," she said, "the house loses its purpose." Thomas replied immediately, "And if nobody leaves, this will never end." Silence. The tension was almost palpable. Then something unexpected happened. One of the walls in the room moved, slowly, as if it had never been fixed. An opening has emerged, dark, deep, and from there came a cold wind, unnatural, loaded. The voices reacted, stronger, closer. "Now, now, now!" The footsteps began to echo from the other side. But those weren't human footsteps. Eleanor instinctively recoiled. "They're coming this way," she said. Thomas didn't move. "No," he replied. "They've always been here." The sound got louder. The dark opening seemed to expand slowly, as if it were breathing. And then, for the first time, something became visible. Shadows, moving within the darkness, undefined forms, but conscious ones. Observing, waiting. The air became almost impossible to breathe. Eleanor held Thomas's arm. "If you do that," she said, her voice faltering, "there's no way to control who goes." Thomas looked at the center of the circle, then onto the opening. Then for her. "I know." The voices fell completely silent, as if they were waiting for the exact moment, as if everything had led up to that point. Thomas stepped forward, entering the circle. The pulse rate increased. The whole house responded. Far away, walls cracked. The stairs partially collapsed. Doors slammed shut. The mansion was reacting to its own fate. Eleanor realized. If that happens, the house might not hold up. Thomas nodded. So this is where it ends. The silence fell like a sentence. The shadows moved a little further. The opening seemed to beckon, and the circle began to glow faintly, as if it were activating something ancient, something inevitable. Thomas closed his eyes for a second. He took a deep breath. And when it opened again, there was no longer any doubt. A choice had to be made. But at that moment, before the house and everything inside it completely spiraled out of control, the air stopped, literally. For an immeasurable instant, everything inside the mansion was suspended. Sound, movement, even the very sensation of time, as if the entire house were holding its breath, waiting. Thomas remained inside the circle. Property. The shadows in the opening advanced slowly, like a dark tide about to surge in. They had no defined form, but carried a presence, heavy, conscious, ancient. Eleanor watched, unable to intervene. For the first time in years, she no longer had control over what was happening. "Do it," whispered a voice. But now it wasn't coming from everyone. It came from only one place, from the center. Thomas closed his eyes. The voices were no longer chaotic. They were clear, organized, direct. They were showing images, lives cut short, final moments, fear, pain, injustice. But they also showed something new, release, not as destruction, as an end. He opened his eyes, and he made his decision. "I'm going," he said in a firm voice. Eleanor stepped forward immediately. "No," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "You don't understand what this means." Thomas looked at her, calm. "I understand more than you think." He slowly let go. "You spent years trying to avoid this, but you only postponed it." The ground began to vibrate. The circle reacted. The shadows drew even closer. "If someone needs to go," he continued, "then it needs to be someone who chooses to go." Silence fell. Heavy, definitive. Eleanor took a step back. Her eyes were full, not of fear, but it's about understanding. Late. "I tried to protect everyone," she said, her voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, "and he succeeded. For a while." The sounds from the house began to intensify again, but now it was different. It wasn't a construction site. It was a collapse, walls creaking, structures collapsing. The mansion was reaching its limit. The cycle was being forced to an end. The voices grew louder one last time, but now there was no anger, just expectation. One for all. One last thing. Thomas took a deep breath. He took another step. Now it was on the verge of opening. It was intensely cold, almost unbearable, but he did not back down. "When this is over," he said without looking back, "don't build anything else." Eleanor did not respond. He couldn't. The shadows drew closer to him, not as an attack, but as a reception. The circle shone brightly. The whole room started shaking. The sound became deafening. And then something unexpected happened. Eleanor stepped forward, fast. Without hesitation, she pushed Thomas out of the circle. "No," she said. Time seemed to slow down. Thomas fell back, confused. "That mistake," she continued, stepping into his place. "It was mine from the start." Her gaze was different, sereno, decided. "I started this," she said. The voices reacted immediately, more intense, closer, but not violent. Acknowledging. "Then I'll finish." Thomas tried to stand up. "Eleanor, no." But it was too late. The circle closed around her. The shadows advanced, involving, consuming, but without brutality. No chaos. It was acceptance. The brightness increased. The opening began to contract, as if it were being sealed. The voices were now one, and for the first time there was peace. End. The light exploded. A silent flash filled the room. And then everything stopped. The sound stopped. The movement disappeared. The air returned. The opening no longer existed. The circle was erased. And in the center of the room there was no one else there. Thomas remained on the ground, breathing with difficulty. The silence was now real, full. For the first time since he entered that house, there were no more voices. The mansion was quiet. But something had changed, definitely, because out there, no construction sounds were returned. The silence that enveloped the mansion was not merely an absence of sound, it was an absence of presence. Thomas remained on the ground for a few minutes, trying to understand what had happened. His body was still trembling, but not from fear. It was as if something that had been constantly pressing on him had finally disappeared. When he finally managed to stand up, he noticed the first concrete sign of change. The air was light. The invisible weight that had accompanied every step, every breath, was gone. The house, which had once seemed unsettlingly alive, was now just a structure. Big, confusing, strange, but empty. Thomas walked slowly out of the room. The door, previously non-existent in any floor plan, was now just another one, ordinary, silent, without presence. He walked across the hallway, and then he realized something even more disturbing. Nothing was changing. The walls remained in place. The stairs didn't creak for no reason. The paths, though still illogical, didn't change anymore. The labyrinth had stopped. Upon descending to the lower levels, he encountered the first workers. Confused. Some sat on the floor, others leaned against the walls, as if they had awakened from a deep trance. They looked around, not understanding where they were, or how much time had passed. "What happened?" one of them asked. Thomas hesitated. There was no simple answer. "It's over," he simply said. And in a way, it was true. The news spread quickly. The workers began to leave the mansion one by one, without questioning, without looking back. There was no longer any reason to stay. The urgency that had previously kept them there had simply vanished. Construction has stopped, definitely. Days later, the property was abandoned, no orders, without official explanation. The city, which had watched from a distance for so long, began to draw closer again. Rumors arose, as always, but now there was something different. No one else reported hearing any sounds. Nobody felt anything anymore. The mansion remained imposing, strange, full of meaningless paths, but it had lost what made it alive. Thomas was the last to leave. Before leaving, he decided to return to the room one last time. The path to get there, which had previously seemed impossible to memorize, was now just complicated. Nothing moved. Nothing changed. When he entered, he found the space exactly as he had left it, without the opening, without the circle, without Eleanor. Just the floor and the objects. But even that had changed. The items that once vibrated with an unsettling energy were now inert, old objects, without a voice, no active memory. The book, still in the center, remained open. Thomas approached. She leafed through it slowly. The names were still there, but something had changed. At the end of the list, there was a new name, Eleanor Whitmore. He carefully closed the book. There was no longer any doubt. The cycle had come to an end, but not forgotten. As he left the room, Thomas did something simple, but significant. He closed the door, this time, not to contain, but to be respected. Outside, the daylight looked different, clearer, more realistic. Months have passed. The mansion remained untouched. No maintenance required, no new workers, no growth. Stories continued to circulate, but now with a different tone. Less fear, more curiosity. Some said it was all an exaggeration. Others believed that something truly happened there, something that could never be fully explained. Thomas never returned. He left the city shortly afterward, taking with him only what he needed and what he remembered. Because some things you just can't leave behind. And even with the absolute silence of the mansion, one thing was certain for him. Not everything that ends disappears. Some things just stop moving. Years later, the mansion remained in absolute silence. The neighbors continued to watch, intrigued, but no supernatural sounds ever returned. Thomas, now far from that city and that life, still felt the weight of the experience. He had learned that some forces cannot be controlled, only respected. Eleanor Whitmore. Her name remained etched in his memory, not as a threat, but as a reminder of courage and sacrifice. The house, imposing and empty, remained there, guarding secrets known only to it. And although no one else dared to enter, the whispers of the past seemed to echo in the silent walls, as if awaiting the next visitor who dared to try to understand its mystery. If you've made it this far, felt every step in this mansion, and followed Thomas and Eleanor's story, share your opinion. What would you do if you were in their shoes? Would you be able to face the unknown, or would you have retreated in fear? Leave your comment, tell us your theory about what really happened inside the Winchester Mystery House, and don't forget to share this story with friends who love macabre and true mysteries. And if you want to see more stories like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because there are secrets waiting to be revealed.